Our second set of papers will be started by Dr. Jessica Montag. She will present her research on corpora and picture book reading. Thank you.
Thank you to the organizers for inviting me, and thank you all for being here. In this talk, I'd like to talk about child-directed text corpora, the very important role it plays in understanding the role of picture books in language development, and theoretical issues relating to the role of language environments more broadly in language development. But then I'm also going to talk about some of the kinds of data that I believe complement text corpora in these endeavors. So the first point I want to make is that we do not write the way that we talk, and this is clear from a variety of different sources. This is one example of lexical diversity of different kinds of speech and text. And what we can see is that text contains more infrequent words, rare words, than does speech, comparing the top red box to the bottom red box. What we also see is that written sources contain more complex sentences, this is various kinds of relative clauses, than do spoken sources. So these are the two spoken sources here, and you see that they have not only fewer relative clauses, but the distribution is quite different. The BNC spoken is maybe a little higher than we might expect for other spoken corpora, and that's because it contains things like court testimony and recordings of business meetings, which may not really be spontaneous speech. The other point I want to make is that we don't write for kids the way that we talk. We can look at the same table here and again see that the rates of rare words in children's books is greater than that of even spoken adult language, the exception being, again, court testimony, that sort of thing, which probably isn't really spontaneous speech. And we can look at rates of different kinds of relative clauses across various adult and child spoken and written corpora. And I'll just put a little line here to divide the spoken and the written, and that we see the written corpora contain more of these complex sentences than do the spoken corpora. Again, this BNC is a little bit unexpected, perhaps again because it contains a lot of language that probably isn't spontaneous spoken language, and so if we kind of ignore that, we see this really clear distinction between the written and the spoken sources, with children's picture books containing more of these complex sentences than does even adult-to-adult spoken language. And so I believe that these written versus spoken patterns really matter. And so in adults, more text exposure is associated with things like better comprehension of complex sentences, better ambiguous pronoun resolution, greater rates of passive relative clause production. And what's really important about these findings is that they're really in the direction that you'd expect, given differences between written and spoken corpora. So we can really see differences between written and spoken language and use those differences to make predictions for behavior. And we see written and spoken patterns matter in kids, too. And so reading to young children, so more text exposure, is associated with various positive language outcomes. But in the child literature, the input from book reading and the output, or the language behavior, is less closely coupled in the adult literature. So it's not really the case that we look at dimensions along which spoken and written child-directed language is different and use that to make predictions for behavior, but rather these language outcomes that people measure are, a little more broad, general, and not necessarily tied to these differences between written and spoken corpora. I think part of the reason for this is that picture book reading is a really complex activity. And so if we think about it, it consists of lots of different sources of language. One being the book text itself. Parents and other caregivers reading the text out loud as they're reading to children. But it also consists of other kinds of language, various extra text behaviors and conversations. And so pointing and labeling, talking about the pictures, maybe rephrasing the story, asking questions, answering questions, that sort of thing. And so it's not really like silent reading that we do as an adult, where our input is the text on the page, but rather that's just one part of the kind of language input that children get when they're read to. So I think one of our goals is to more closely link picture books and language outcomes. This will enable us to better understand the role of picture books in language development, and better understand the role of the language environment and the kinds of learning mechanisms that underlie language learning. And so a question that we have to answer before we can more closely link the language generated from picture book reading with language outcomes is, what does the input during picture book reading really look like? And I think it consists of two different sources of input. The book text, and so to understand the role of the book text, we might ask how the book text is different from that of child-directed speech. as well as other speech. So this is the labeling, the question asking, the rephrasing, all of this extra text speech, which is nonetheless a part of book reading episodes. So I'm going to go through these too and talk about what we know about what this language looks like that's generated during picture book reading. So picture books and child-directed speech vary along all sorts of dimensions. In my own work, I've shown that picture books contain more unique words. So a matched sample of picture books has more unique words than a sample of child-directed speech. And picture books contain more unique words than a length-matched conversation of the same length. I've also shown that picture books contain more complex sentences like relative clauses or main clause passives than does child-directed speech. And so these are some important dimensions along which the language in picture books is different from child-directed speech and maybe giving children a very different slice of language. There's all sorts of other differences too that you might think about and you might want to investigate. Really, whatever you end up looking at, you see these big differences between picture books and child-directed speech. And this may inspire other avenues for research to look at ways in which the language contained in picture books is different from child-directed speech and experiments you might do down the line to see consequences of these differences. So, conjunctions you can take a look at, words like and but are much more common in picture books than child-directed speech. We can look at the distribution of pronouns. You can see that speech contains a lot of you and it, which probably makes sense, whereas he and she are far more common in picture books, as well as contextual diversity. This is just a measure of the number of different words contained in a 5-word window, so the more different words you see in a 5-word window from each word, the more contextually diverse that word might be. And so no matter how we end up measuring this, we see more contextual diversity in picture books than in child-directed speech. And given the role that we see in experimental data of contextual diversity in things like word learning, word recognition, perhaps this is an important dimension to look at when thinking about differences between the text of picture books and typical child-directed speech. And so looking at differences between speech and picture book corpora can generate hypotheses for dimensions along which children should vary who maybe get more or less experience with picture book text. This suggests a pathway by which picture book reading affects language outcomes. It's really about exposure to a different kind of language that children wouldn't be getting if they weren't being exposed to these picture books. And so here's just a little example of this. This is, think about this as the speech that a child hears during the day, a typical speech and some picture book reading. This is, one 680-word book in my picture book corpus. That was the average length of the book. It amounts to about 3 to 4% of a child's daily input, which is more or less on par with what we see from day-long recording studies, that sort of thing. So these 680 words, so a single book, would, on average, contain one passive sentence. And in the rest of the day, if we look at rates of passive sentences in typical child-directed speech, they might get about 2 passives. And so even just a single book a day could lead to 50% more passives every day. So in this sense, picture books are not only very different from the kinds of typical language in child-directed speech, but rather even small amounts could have a meaningful effect on the rates of exposure to different kinds of language. Let's go back to thinking about the input that is generated during picture book reading, and let's talk about other kinds of speech that's generated at the same time. Let's think of the kind of language that's generated during picture book reading beyond the text of the book. So unlike silent reading, when adults and older children read to themselves, the language input generated during picture book reading is spoken, and consists of some combination of picture book text and extra text conversation. And so for this reason, I think thinking about the book text is a really, really great start and tells us really important facts about how typical child-directed speech is different from the text of picture books. But because there just is all of this extra text conversation, the corpus analyses alone perhaps paint an incomplete picture. And so what we really want to know is what goes on in homes when caregivers read to young children. To begin to answer this question, my lab made in-home recordings of caregivers reading to young children. This is work that was led by postdoc Anastasia Stoops. And what we did was we recorded 12 families with children between the ages of 24 and 37 months reading at home as they normally would. We gave them little digital recorders like this, and they recorded home book reading on their own at home. We recorded a total about 20 hours, so 183 individual book recordings across these 12 families. And so 125 of these recordings were books that they already had at home, and 58 were books that we gave to them that varied in different ways that we were interested in. We are in the process of transcribing and annotating all these audio recordings, and we intend to make this an available resource for other researchers when we are done. So what I'm going to focus now is those 58, so it's about 9 hours of recordings of the books that we provided to them. And so we gave families 4 different books. Each family had 3 of them that varied in length and the number of complex constructions. And so these are different kinds of relative clauses as well as main clause passives. And so we really wanted to see how different features of the book might change how families read. And so just to give you a sense of what these books look like, this is not a good idea. There was just pages with a very small amount of text and a lot of pictures interleaved. When Dinosaurs came with everything, this kind of larger chunks of text overlaid on pictures. Stella Luna, this was the longest book, a lot of long pages of text like this, interspersed with full-page pictures, and the places you'll go, kind of these larger or smaller chunks of text on the pictures. And so this is just to give you a sense of what the books looked like. And so the first thing we see, not surprisingly, is that reading durations vary quite a bit by family and by book. And so the shorter, simple book, we see people spent less time reading, but we also see across the books lots and lots of variability per family. So maybe you see the family indicated by the brown dot, generally at the higher end, maybe the family indicated by the yellow dot, often at the lower end. So we do see, of course, lots of variability by family. This is not terribly unexpected. But what we also see is caregivers really do read the text. And what I'm showing you here are the proportions of different kinds of complex sentences that were read out loud. And you see that families are overwhelmingly reading these complex sentences as they appear in the text. This is actually a very conservative coding scheme that we have here. So adding a couple words or a clarification in between would count as not reading the sentence. And so it really is, across the 12 families, caregivers are overwhelmingly reading these complex sentences as they appear, such that they really are getting into the language input of the children. It's not just that they're on the page, but maybe not being read out loud. They really are being read out loud. But what we also see is that different books generate different kinds of conversation. And so what I have here plotted is the number of turn counts per minute across the 4 different books. And we see that there's quite a bit of variability. Obviously, we see lots of variability across families, but we also, maybe see some variability across books, with the short, simple book really having quite a bit more turns than maybe some of the longer, more complex books. And so I'm going to just kind of remind you what these books look like. I'll show you Not a Good Idea, which had the most turns, and Stella Luna, which had the fewest. So again, this is Not a Good Idea looked like. Lots of pages with small amounts of text interspersed with kind of interesting pictures. And Stella Luna really was a lot of text. It's a complex narrative story interspersed with these sorts of pictures every couple pages. And so it really is interesting to think about, assuming that this data is reliable. Again, this is a small sample. This is only 4 different books. But it's interesting to think of ways in which the text itself may affect the different kinds of talk that's generated. And so these simple books with kind of interesting pictures might really facilitate a lot of back and forth conversation between caregivers. Whereas books like Stella Luna, with kind of this complex, complicated, flowing narrative, might really facilitate, everyone just kind of being quiet and listening to the story. And in fact, in other work coming out of my lab, we see that some of the older kids we look at, so these are, over 2.5, into 3-year-olds, for these more complicated books, they really just like to sit there and listen to the story, perhaps because they have the language skills, to really appreciate this kind of interesting, complex story. So, again, this extra text talk is certainly a part of the input that's generated when caregivers read to children, but it may not actually be independent of the text itself. And so just another way in which understanding features of the text that's actually in the picture book is important for understanding not just differences in speech versus text corpora, but also how it may promote different kinds of talk during picture book reading. And so to summarize what we learned about reading in homes is that we see a lot of variability across families, even in our college town sample. And the complex sentences really do become a part of the linguistic input. And so if we're doing corpus analyses comparing picture book text to child-directed speech, it's really not crazy to think that those complex sentences really are becoming a part of the children's linguistic input. And we see some trade-offs between book characteristics. We happen to see in the sample that our syntactically simple book had the most turn-taking, generated the most back-and-forth conversation, but the most, maybe its coherent story, complex story, had the least turn-taking. And so it really could be the case that different books provide different kinds of input. Some may be great for providing kids with lots of complex syntax or rich vocabulary or narrative structure, others for turn-taking and having children practice asking and answering questions. And I think all of these are things that we would think would be important to do with young children, but it may not be the case that a single kind of book is providing everything, and different kinds of books, depending on the text and the pictures, may provide very different kinds of input. And so to return to the point earlier, picture book reading being this complex activity consisting of both the picture book text and extra text behavior and conversation, I really think the book text is an underappreciated source of linguistic input. And like in the adult literature, I think it would be great to look at differences between picture book text and typical child-directed speech and use those dimensions to make predictions for behavior. On the other hand, we see these extra text behavior and conversations. I think these tend to be more often studied. There's a lot of studies that look at the extra text behavior and conversation that's generated, turn-taking, question-asking, that sort of thing. And, I certainly don't want to downplay that literature. This is clearly an important part of linguistic input. But what I think some of the data coming out of my lab is showing is that this conversation itself may depend on features of the text. So overall, we really do want to think about the text of the book when trying to better understand the kind of language that's generated during picture book reading, this very complex activity. So my view of the open questions in the field right now is that I really think we need better links between linguistic input that's generated during picture book reading and language outcomes. And so really thinking about the dimensions along which picture book text and child-directed speech are different, and using those dimensions to make predictions for language outcomes more like has been done in the adult literature. I would really love to see a lot more of this brought over to the child literature as well, to really more closely couple the dimensions along which we think experience is changing as you get more picture book experience, and then seeing those same dimensions play out in the behavioral measures of language outcomes. And so in this whole endeavor, we can't forget about the text of the book. That it is both an important driver of the dimensions along which picture book reading and child-directed speech may be different, and it will inspire all sorts of hypotheses for the ways in which we might expect language outcomes to be different for a child getting lots of picture book experience and maybe very little. And likewise, we see that the text of the book itself may actually have consequences for the kinds of extra text language, labeling, pointing, question asking, answering conversation that's generated during picture book reading. Another point that I really want to make is that I think it's unlikely that we're ever going to determine there's sort of a best way to read to kids, and that prescriptions for parents aren't going to be to do a certain specified set of activities during picture book reading. I think what we're going to find is that different books and different reading styles provide different kinds of input. Perhaps some books and some styles, provide more complex sentences, rare vocabulary, experience with story narrative. Others provide more practice to talk, ask questions, answer questions, engage in conversation. And it's not necessarily sensible to think that one of these is better than the other one, but rather a varied range of experiences with different kinds of books, different kinds of reading styles is probably what we're going to find is an ideal way to engage children with picture books. So thank you all for listening. Thank you to my lab, the Learning and Language Lab at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and thank you also to my funding agencies.
Thank you very much, Dr. Montag. I was going to ask if you think that if you have ever come across studies that looked at family literacy or reading in families that do not use picture books as stimuli.
You do see some work with textless picture books, which are they the same thing? Are they different? Are they something different? I think you see that kind of thing. And of course, there's lots of work on various home language habits, about comparing book reading sessions with playing with toys, with other kinds of things that caregivers do. But it's we don't see a ton of stuff, things like folklore and oral narrative, that sort of thing, which I think would be really interesting to see more of. And one of the things I really loved about the folklore corpus that we heard about earlier today is it's a kind of non-spontaneous speech that isn't written. And I think that sort of language we really need to think about a lot more, because I suspect it has a lot in common with books, because you're not coming up with all the words and sentences on the fly. So it's not really unplanned spontaneous speech. And I think that's something that we need to think about quite a bit more, because I suspect that things like song and nursery rhyme that aren't spontaneous but also aren't written are perhaps really important for young kids. We just don't really think about it.
Right. I think that kind of conversation occurs very often in indigenous peoples communities and homes, and that also needs a bit of study. And let's go to the question of teacher Portia.
Actually, I don't know if it's a question or a rejoinder, maybe, to what Dr. Ocampo said earlier. We've been talking about it in the last couple of days or nights. The fact that a good number of the studies that we've heard about, and much of the literature we've read on corpus, on language and reading, is anchored on children's book reading, home, and all that. Yes, we do recognize it's important, but we have to wrestle with the fact that for many of our Filipino families, there just aren't books at home. But it doesn't mean that the children have no exposure to print, or that they don't have any exposure to the narrative structure through the sharing of family stories and histories. And like what was mentioned earlier by our colleagues from the Promise Foundation, through the telling of the oral tradition in the form of folklore, whether they be in prose or poetry. And we believe we need to capture that as well, because it's not only indigenous peoples from different parts of the world, but more importantly, among low and middle income nations where access to children's books is not as easy as it is in more developed countries.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, there's kind of two different issues. There's the fact that these sorts of language are a real and important part of kids' lives all over the world. And if we really want to paint a picture of the kinds of language that kids hear in order to draw conclusions about what the learning processes might be by which you're inputting, taking in all this language and learning yourself, then this is something that just quite practically we have to consider. And I think there's also the second issue that I will admit that this is a very kind of American centric, very weird sorts of project that I've been doing. I will admit that with the kind of tools and resources I have, this is how I can answer a lot of my hypothesis driven research questions. And I would really love to in the future think beyond the kinds of people that are living in my community, and do work that's more representative of what their lived experiences are.
Last comment, Shreya? Yes.
Hi, I really enjoyed your presentation, and I just wanted to ask one question. So I'm quite interested in cultural narratives and cultural identities in picture books and children's literature. So I was kind of wondering as to, would you perhaps see maybe a difference in turn taking and child directed speech if the books that you had chosen for the community was culturally directed at the community? I mean, I don't know the family dynamics or the cultural dynamics. So I was just thinking if there's cultural diversity in the community and the books that they read.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. We haven't gotten a chance to look at that too much. There's, I live in a college town. Not all of them are affiliated with a university, but it's everyone kind of living and working in a college town. But in our community, we have both, rural families who live on farms, as well as, a lot of immigrant families who, with parents who didn't grow up in the US speaking English, and other kind of non-college educated families as well. And, this is like a day-to-day struggle that we have, our group of language researchers and child researchers trying to get those families into the lab. They're a lot harder to bring into the lab than the university families. They're a lot harder to contact. They're not as interested in participating in our studies. And this is just a day-to-day struggle, because even we've found it difficult to tap into the diversity we have in our own community, which is, nothing compared to the worldwide diversity that we see. But I would love to have better news for you, but we're going to try, and I'll report back.
We just have to work together.
Yes.
Thank you very much.